I'm so pleased that we've got the opportunity to now talk and get this conversation recorded, because obviously we have had a lot of conversations before when we met during the conference, and also when you were visiting me. And I'm just really sort of very happy that we get the opportunity to just pick up on a couple of the thoughts that we have already discussed when we were on a one-to-one basis, or also when we were with Selina the other day. So yeah, it's really just very interesting. So I haven't got any particular agenda for this conversation. I just really want to get into a conversation about really your interesting background and probably the reason why we engaged and why we sort of talk to each other. So why don't we just get it kickstarted with you just giving a sort of the highlights of what you think is important or unusual about your history, your work, the stuff that you're dealing with.
Okay. Well, I always like to shock people by starting off by saying I was a psychic spy for the U.S. Army. And that always kind of sends back. I say, what, a psychic spy? Do you mean like you find out a whole bunch of things and then try and analyze them? I say, no, no, it's not at all like that. What it is in fact, essentially it's a way of projecting one's consciousness to a distant location and collecting information, impressions, and so on. It's really a form of ESP, extrasensory perception, or controlled clairvoyance, if you will, disciplined clairvoyance, something like that. And that's usually quite a conversation starter, as you could imagine.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, this is something which is really unusual, and you know that my topic is consciousness, right? And what we can do with consciousness, and that's why I'm so overwhelmed by the information that you bring and also the background that you bring. I mean, focusing consciousness somewhere else to get some information which you use for sort of intelligence purposes, so that you basically can work as a spy, is a sort of mind-boggling kind of thing, isn't it? Because that is not what the average person does on this planet.
No, and of course there are those who totally believe it's impossible. And then there's everybody else who thinks that it might be possible, but they don't have any hard evidence for it. And then there's a relatively small number of people who have actually done it or seen it done and know that it works. So the vast majority of people out there, this is something that's not been on their radar. And then when it is put on the radar, that opens up a whole new set of possibilities as far as how the universe is actually put together. So
yeah, so tell us about the hard evidence, because with my background being a mechanical engineer, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily believe all that spooky kind of stuff that might be going on there. So what is the evidence that you have witnessed? What is the evidence that has been pulled together by the US military? And I mean, give us some facts, some details, which actually could lead to that conclusion.
So first, there's two kinds of evidence. There's laboratory evidence, and then there is actual practical applied evidence, if you will. Let me give a real brief sketch of how this all developed. So the CIA discovered in the 60s that the Soviets were exploring what we would call here in the United States as paranormal kinds of things. And they were expending literally hundreds of millions of dollars in it. And that's not rubles, that's dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, researching what we would call paranormal or fringe science kinds of things. And one thing the CIA knew was that the Soviets didn't spend money on things they didn't expect to have some kind of a payout for. So they thought, oh man, we got to figure this out. Well, one of those synchronicity kinds of things, a research scientist at Stanford Research Institute, it's now called SRI International, but it was the research arm of Stanford University, and did a lot of government contracts, classified work. This research scientist was working on some fundamental physics things and got wind of another researcher who had actually been able to mentally affect closed systems like thermistors and things like that. And he thought, well, maybe there's something I can learn about quantum physics from this. Very cautiously, because his friends all warned him, don't deal with these guys, they're all frauds. If you have an experiment you want them to do, it better be really, really tight and really well controlled. So he had actually such an experiment. He invited this guy out named Ingo Swann, and they invited him to affect the insides of a very sophisticated quark detector that was in the basement of the Varian Physics building at Stanford University. And it was a highly shielded, it was designed to detect quarks. And the only way to detect quarks is to eliminate all the other possible interactions from outside. And so this is very highly shielded. And Swann proceeded to actually indeed affect the machine mentally. It was very clear that he had no physical interaction with it. And not only that, but more interestingly, was able to describe the interior and describe the mechanism of this device, which had never been published. Swann could not possibly have known anything about that. And so that really put off, he wasn't doing this for the CIA, he was doing this on his own. And he published a little letter about it to his friends, and it got onto what they laughingly called the weird desk at the CIA, the desk at the CIA that was supposed to deal with all the kinds of things they didn't know what else to do with, right? And that just fit in perfectly what the CIA needed to do. So they came, and the way Hal talks about it, he says, I got this knock on the door, and I opened the door, and there's these guys in dark suits wearing sunglasses and saying, "We're from the CIA. Did you write this?" And they hold up the paper that he had written, and he said he didn't know whether to slam the door or say yes.
Sounds like from a bad movie, a scene of a bad movie.
Really, Men in Black, right? So he said yes, and then they ended up giving SRI a contract to research this stuff, and then later when the CIA had to pull out for other reasons. The Air Force got involved, and then the Army, and then the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the program continued for a quarter of a century. Not far into it, they continued to research, but they realized, hey, if this is working, we should exploit it for intelligence value. And so they actually set up an applications program at Fort Meade, Maryland, which is where I came involved with it. They recruited me for the program, and we proceeded to spy on the Soviets or the Hezbollah or narco traffickers or Chinese nuclear tests or whatever, whatever the military needed. And as I tell people, it didn't work all the time, which makes skeptics happy. It didn't work all the time. But I said there were times when it absolutely did work, that there was no other explanation for it than that ESP actually works. Mm-hmm. And that was the truth. So that leads into the evidence. So we have both research laboratory evidence, we have practical evidence. There were indeed cases that U.S. defense purposes were served by this remote viewing. The best, I'll say the best evidence, but the most easily accessible evidence is in the counter-narcotics role. We have not, they ran us in the counter-narcotics role, and they were able to use us on roughly 100 projects where they're trying to interdict drugs, they're trying to capture drug traffickers or whatever. And in that 100 cases, and this was assessed not by us, not by the remote viewers, this was assessed by the Joint Task Force intelligence and operations personnel that we were working for. They determined that 30% of the time, the information provided was of no use. 30% of the time it was mixed. When I say 30, it works out to roughly a third. A third of the time it was of mixed use. Some of it was correct, some of it wasn't, or some of it just wasn't useful. And then a final third of the time it was instrumental in actually solving the intelligence problem. And they gave us some examples of that. One was where we actually located the contraband and described where it was located, how it was wrapped, and actually located it on a desert island about 20 miles square. And it was hidden actually under a boulder that they never would have found if the remote viewers hadn't pinpointed them. And that's just one example of numerous examples where we were very successful. And then, of course, in the laboratory, I can't tell you all the statistics here because I don't have them right in my head. I have to look at it on paper. But we're talking about 10 to the minus ridiculous, odds against chance of the laboratory evidence that they produced for this thing called remote viewing.
Yeah, I mean, one figure I recall from our conversations and from the book, from your book that I was reading, there is a figure in there, I think, which really blew me away. It's around 25,449 experiments which have been conducted over these 16 years between 1972 and 1988, as far as I remember. And I think, as you say, I think it's overwhelming because the probability or the likelihood that these positive results are only by chance, I think, is 1 to, as you say, I think it's whatever it was, huge figure. I think 12.3 trillion or something like that was the figure that I recall, but a huge figure. So which basically means that from a statistical evidence, as you say, it basically leads to the conclusion or the strong hint that it is very unlikely that all of those phenomena are just a result of by chance, right? So it's very likely that is really tangible, which would mean that somehow the work that the Stanford Research Unit Institute had done together with the US military actually sort of really points into the direction that extrasensory perception is really a tangible phenomenon, right? It's not just a weird kind of thing, but it's a tangible phenomenon.
Although using the word tangible is a little strange in this context, right?
Yeah, but a real phenomenon.
And I want to point out that was just one set of studies. There have been numerous groupings of studies, all of which point in that same direction. So when you do meta-analysis on it, it becomes even more ridiculously improbable that it's accidental.
And I don't know whether you were actually aware, but I had Brenda Dunn here staying with us 2 weeks ago. So
cool.
from the Peer Lab, and we had an interesting conversation around all of those studies that the Peer Lab has done, which also was not just transcending sort of locations, like I think the focus of the study that you did with the US military, but this also sort of transcended not only space, but also time. I think Brenda had then led into this idea of sort of transcending time as well. So it's as you say, I think from a metadata point of view, it's probably even bigger.
It's amazingly strong, very strong evidence. Yeah.
But this is mind blowing because I mean, obviously we have got there some apparently real phenomenon which no one can really sort of explain. I mean, do you have from the work that the military has done and from what your own experiences are, have you got the slightest clue how one could explain that? What's happening there?
Well, there's various hypotheses. There's one that makes use of the multi-dimensional model that people are trying to develop today. There's one that probably the most popular one has to do with quantum non-locality or quantum entanglement. I don't know if you need an explanation of that.
Yeah, probably just one or two.
Okay, so the idea is that it was actually what Einstein called spooky action at a distance, and he didn't like it. but he and two other folks were the ones who actually introduced the possibility of it in a paper they wrote in as I recall, the 30s. The idea is that if you have two subatomic particles that have been closely associated in the past, they become entangled. And then if they then later become separated, if you exert some sort of influence on one, such as you change it from one of its properties from, say, upspin to downspin, for example, you don't need to know what those mean, but change one of those properties, that same property on its sister particle will instantly change as well, no matter how far apart they are. And it isn't causal, it's a correlation. There's all kinds of complications here, but the fact is, essentially, the universe is in a way connected with itself in a way that transcends your normal notions of causation, and it certainly transcends the speed limit of space, which is, the speed of light. Yeah. This is an instantaneous thing. You can be on either side of the galaxy, and this effect would still occur instantaneously. So some people think ESP seems to work kind of like that. And so they propose, well, maybe it's a function of quantum non-locality. I have my doubts about that. I think and because, first of all, quantum non-locality doesn't deal with time in particular. There is maybe some small time component in it, but so far it's only been at the very micro level. And it doesn't deal with the kind of information that one gets in a remote viewing or another ESP kind of context. So to me, I think quantum non-locality is a non-starter, but because it has promise of fitting it into a physical worldview, a lot of people find it popular. I think my own opinion is that what ESP, non-remote viewing, and the various other aspects of it actually are evidence of is another aspect to the universe, essentially what you might call a non-physical aspect. And that freaks out scientists because they're invested very heavily in everything being physical, right? But since you're concerned with consciousness, we could talk in terms of consciousness. The physicists and everybody who does their reductions from physics, right? So psychology or whatever, none of them have been able to explain consciousness. And they keep coming up with these mathematical formulas. Max Tegmark, for example, came up with a formula that he said explained consciousness. If you look at it, it doesn't explain anything. It's a smoke and mirrors thing to try and fit it within physics, and it doesn't fit consciousness within physics. And there's just been no success at that. To me, I believe that consciousness is independent of physics, which actually answers the criticism a lot of people bring up when they want to put down ESP. They say, well, if ESP were true, if remote viewing were true, it would violate the laws of physics. My answer to that is no, it doesn't. It would only violate the laws of physics if it were within the physical domain. Mm-hmm. But if consciousness, well, and we'll talk in terms of consciousness, maybe it's something else, but if consciousness exists in its own sphere and physics exists in its own sphere, the rules of consciousness would not apply to physics, and the rules of physics would not apply to consciousness. So you don't violate anything by having conscious phenomena operating. Yeah. Of course, the other argument there is that, well, if it's not physical, then it's impossible for it to interact with the physical universe. And I say, why? What makes you say that? We have all kinds of, within physics itself, within the physics domain, we have all kinds of physical phenomena that aren't the same thing ontologically, that aren't the same thing in terms of how they're made. But there are bridge laws and bridge principles that allow them to interact. So why couldn't there be bridge laws and bridge principles in nature that allow non-physical things to interact with physical things and vice versa? Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, there might be limitations to that, but there's absolutely no reason to say that physical and non-physical things can't interact in some way due to some constraints or principles in the universe.
So if we basically recollect what you've just said, we can make a tick in a box sort of in terms of the evidence. So we have got practical evidence and hard evidence, which seems to indicate that that is a real phenomenon. Sort of extrasensory perception is a real phenomenon. And now we have basically explored whether there are already useful theories which would build the theoretical basis to explain that apparently existing phenomenon. And you've said that quantum non-locality might be a kind of an explanation. You would probably not think that that is the full explanation, but that consciousness plays a more fundamental role in the explanation of how reality really works. So we would have the physical realm, and you say that there is a consciousness, a non-physical aspect apparently existing, which would then explain these phenomena which we have just discovered, or which we have just been talking about. So I think what you say is that there is the physical side of it, and there is consciousness. We don't really know how exactly it works. We don't know whether we should call it consciousness or probably information or whatever it is, but there is this kind of beast which seems to exist somehow, and which seems to somehow interact. There seems to be an interaction or a connection between this consciousness aspect and the physical aspect as we seem to understand it so far.
Well, that's a good way of putting it. I'm a little nervous about the word information.
Mm-hmm.
That's a popular meme these days. It explains things in terms of information, but what people forget is that information doesn't exist in its own context. Information requires a substrate to exist.
Mm-hmm.
And so that suggests to me that there's something more to it than just the existence of information. And I think there really may be some kind of, so interesting because we live in a physical universe. Mostly, we generally have to talk in physical terms even about things that might not be physical, right? So I talked about a consciousness field, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe there is a consciousness field. Now, a field is a physical thing, not necessarily tangible, right? But physical, right? So, but for want of a better term to use, maybe there's a consciousness field that has existed as long as matter has. And it's independent of matter, and it's this consciousness field that may be the substrate for the kind of information that you were thinking about a minute ago. And obviously, we don't know really what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Irony is, when we start talking about matter and things like that, we still don't know what we're talking about, even though the physicists pretend like they do, right? Mm-hmm. We know a lot about it, but when you get right down to the fundamentals, we really don't know what it is.
Yes. Yes, and there we have got this equivalent between matter and energy. So we have got another terminology around energy. So we've got matter, we've got energy, we've got information, we've got consciousness. I think we've got all of those kind of fuzzy concepts which we try to get our head around. But we really, as you say, when we really dig deep into this, we seem not to really get the full grasp of it in any of those domains so far. But I think this is the interesting thing, because we are now approaching these kind of phenomena. We are approaching new scientific theories, and we're trying to get closer to an understanding. But I think it is probably fair to say, I don't know whether you would support that hypothesis, but it's fair to say that we are not really there in terms of having a fully fledged theory and a comprehensive understanding of how reality really works.
No, and in fact, because a theory is a cognitive thing, it's really just a model anyway. Right?
Yes.
So we have models, but it's kind of like Kant talked about, where we can conceive, we can perceive, we can experience, but the bare nature of the universe, the essential thing of the universe, we can't really experience. We have to do it through our senses. We have to do it through, Ding an sich was Kant's phrase, right? And we can't get into that.
Yeah.
Obviously, we can infer lots of things because we have these experiences, and we produce the data, and we the experiments we conduct indicate things about it, and flesh out the parameters of this thing. But the actual core of all of this, we have no direct access to.
Yeah. So we have sort of established that this phenomenon seems to be real. We have a couple of ideas on how it might work, but we are not really sort of clear on exactly how it works. But in terms of the practicality of what do you do when you do remote viewing? I mean, what do you do? Do you have to wear a helmet? Or I've got no idea. I mean, walk us through. What practically do you do if you try to get some sort of remote information? Do you have to get into a kind of trance? Help me understand what actually happens when
That's the interesting thing about this is it doesn't require that you get into any kind of altered state of consciousness. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, if you're in a remote viewing session for a while, because some of these can last an hour, hour and a half, by the time you're done, you reach a state that we refer to as dingy. You just kind of spaced out, it's a sort of an altered state of consciousness, but it's the same sort of state you get in if you concentrate very hard on some kind of artistic performance or artistic creation. So you don't have to be in an altered state to do it. What you do have to do is, well, let me back out of that and come in from a different angle. So when people ask me, as you know, I have a extensive remote viewing training program. I teach a lot of people how to do this. And people say, well, when you teach someone to remote view, what is it you teach them? And I say, well, there's a whole complicated process and all of this, just like in any trying to transfer any skill. But if you break it down into its fundamental components, there are two things I teach them. I teach them how to recognize the signal. There's the very subtle, if you will, psychic signal that's coming into your mind. I teach them how to recognize that subtle signal so that they can then objectify it on paper or make a model of it or verbalize, whatever. The other thing I teach them is how to be able to differentiate that signal from all of the mental noise that we have going on in our heads at any given time. All of the thoughts and memories and guesses and speculations and distractions and all that stuff that are in our heads and serve to mask that signal if you haven't learned how to sort those two out. There's an old joke in the Army about the air defense artillery. So the story goes that somebody was talking to an officer from the air defense artillery, and of course their job, the air defense artillery, is to shoot down the enemy planes that might be threatening your troops, right? So this guy comes up to the officer, the air defense artillery officer, and says, there's something that always puzzled me. Yeah. So you have all these planes up there, and some of them were enemy and some of them were friendly. How do you know which ones to shoot down and which ones not to shoot down? And the air defense artillery guy says, well, that's easy. We just shoot them all down and sort them out on the ground.
Yeah, it's certainly a very solid method, isn't it?
That's right. At least it certainly accomplishes what you're trying to do right now. In a way, that's what you do in remote viewing. You record everything you're experiencing, and then you learn to sort out which is the signal from the noise in the process. It's very effective. I mean, you don't always get rid of all the noise. There's always noise in any communications channel. That's what Claude Shannon, the famous scientist who came up with signal to noise ratio back in the 50s, right? There's always noise in a channel, but the more noise you can extract from the signal, the purer your signal becomes. And that is really the main feature of remote viewing training, is to help you learn to sort the noise from the signal. And of course, recognize the signal in the first place.
So would you go as far as to say that the signal is always there, but it's in most of the cases just sort of covered by a lot of noise? So would you go as far to say, okay, the signal does exist anyhow, so we do get these signals, and the real art of remote viewing is to really sort of peel off the noise levels so that you can actually distinguish the noise from the signal?
Well, to use another physical metaphor, right? Part of this is also to learn how to tune into the signal. I would say the signal is always there, but we don't attend to it, right? We're not paying attention to it, so we don't notice it. Plus, it's a case of trying to capture the particular part of the signal that has to do with the channel or the target that you want to address. So I like to use the Eiffel Tower as an example. Let's pretend like the Eiffel Tower is a training target you want to run a student on. So there are lots of things a student can get information on. It could be the Eiffel Tower, the Washington Monument, the Grand Canyon, all of these different kinds of things. And all of those are available in the world. You don't want them to tell you about the Grand Canyon. You want them to perceive and describe the Eiffel Tower. And so part of the training is to help them learn how to home in on the actual desired target. That goes into intentionality. We talked about the tasker's intent. The tasker being the person who assigns the target to the viewer. And it's the tasker's intent that actually drives the train in this remote viewing process. Tasker decides what the target is and what needs to be known about the target. And then the viewer, through the process, the viewer is then trained how to do that. Now, there's another piece of this puzzle that folks need to be aware of, that the viewer actually is never told what the target is. The viewer should be working at least blind and usually double blind to a target. And what that means essentially, they can't know what the target is, and no one who's associating with them at the time of the remote viewing or before should know what the target is either. And and people say, oh yeah, that's to stop them from cheating.
Mm-hmm.
The real answer is no. I mean, yeah, that's to keep them from cheating. But the real answer is that knowing what the target is actually makes it harder to remote view, because then everything you know about the target or can guess about it is right there in your head. And then that subtle, nuanced signal that's trying to get in there that brings you the information that you don't know about the target, that has a really hard time of getting through all of that added noise that comes from knowing what the target is.
Because you're already preoccupied with an idea of the target, right? I mean,
Yes.
you might know Eiffel Tower is in Paris, you might know sort of the structure of the Eiffel Tower. So all of this information which you have picked up through throughout the time. So your concept of the Eiffel Tower basically then gets into the way of picking up the real subtle signal that you were referring to.
Preoccupied is a good word, but it's not just preoccupied, it's also prejudiced.
Mm-hmm.
Knowing the target is prejudices you, whatever the word is, even in English.
Don't ask me, I'm German.
Yeah. Well, there's probably a better German word for it. There is the
Vorurteil.
Yeah, Vorurteil. There's too many R's in there, but yeah. So that biases you. That's probably the better word here. It biases you in a certain direction and in favor of certain information that may not be the kind of information you need from this target. And so viewers have to be blind in order for this to work properly.
Yeah, no, this makes sense. And what's actually stunning is the fact that what you've just explained is apparently we can train people to do this, right? We can, and you do this. I mean, this is your core business these days now that you have retired.
Over and over again, I train many people. That's right. One of the things that came out of the research at SRI and other places, because other places did research on this as well, it was not produced in just one lab. One of the interesting things came out is that it appears that pretty much everybody has this ability to one degree or another. It's just that most of us haven't realized we have that ability, and so we haven't developed it. And, so all I'm doing, I'm not giving people a new capability. I'm essentially giving them a skill to leverage a capability they already have.
You already have. So would you say that there are probably also talented or less talented people which you basically meet? I mean, do people, apparently, as you say, the ability as such seems to exist in all of us. This is, I think, what I've picked up from you. But would you say that some people have gotten easier access to this ability than others? So would you say that there is something like talented people and less talented people?
So some people do get better at it, and there are some who are really good. There are some who, a very small number, don't have any success at all. The vast majority of people fall in between, just like any other kind of complex human skill. People who play the piano, you have people who are really outstanding, people that just never quite get it. But most people are in the middle, and if they apply themselves, they can learn to play the piano in a way that is pleasing to people, other people to listen to. And of course, that's usually the goal, right? So that's the case. I was going to say something. Talent. Oh, yes. I'm not sure it's a matter of talent in any field. I'm very suspicious of the word talent. People use it, and I think it's misused most of the time. There isn't, I don't think, a remote viewing gene. Right. I don't think there's a piano playing gene. I think that all of us have roughly equivalent abilities in these various fields. Where the talent comes in, if you want to talk talent, is in the ability to learn and the ability to let go of preconceptions or previous ideas you might have had about something and allow yourself to actually learn a process and be committed to learning the principles and practice it. And those who are able to learn something quickly are what we usually call talented. The talent isn't remote viewing or violin playing or anything else. The talent is in learning. I think that's where it comes from.
No, I see what you mean. So from your experience, I mean, I think a lot of people, and I'm asking myself the question actually. I mean, if I don't need to have a talent as such, if I basically carry this ability inside myself somehow anyhow, and if I just need to sort of get access to this, so I can learn it. I mean, how long would it take? I mean, is it a matter of, it is a matter of years? I mean, obviously you will, I would expect that you learn sort of more and more, and you get probably a bit more trained in this. But what is the kind of time frame that we are talking about? I mean, if someone would actually get to one of your courses, one of your classes, I mean, does it take months, years, weeks? I have no idea.
That somewhat depends on the person and their life circumstances, which is true of most skills, right? So if you have unlimited time to work on this, let's say you're independently wealthy and you become very excited about the process, you can reach a fairly high level of competency within a couple of months, probably. You're always learning, obviously, so you haven't reached the max just in a couple of months, right? Most people tend to take, even the ones who continue on with it because of, they have other things going on in their lives, they'll usually take a year or two to get really good at it, because there's a lot of practice involved. If you make this your main hobby and have a different day job and still work at it, then probably half a year you might be doing this part-time. You could probably become operational. What I call operational is somebody who can actually be of use in practical projects like, I don't know, finding missing kids or industrial espionage or whatever you might be wanting to apply it for. To actually have some capability in a particular motor that's called ARV, Associative Remote Viewing, you could be up and running in a week.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
So at least to a degree that I would feel some, let's say, success.
Yeah.
So it's not that I'm leaving frustrated. I think what I hear you saying is I might perceive some success already after a short while. So I don't need to practice for 3.5 years before I get my first kind of successful.
No, that extended period I'm addressing is for people who want to become fully operational, able to handle any situation, within the constraints of the phenomenon. And that, this thing called associative remote viewing allows you to predict the future outcome of the outcome of a future event. So, for example, who are two rival football teams in Europe?
Take Manchester United and Bayern München.
Okay, Bayern München?
Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll say Munich and Manchester, okay? Yeah. Okay, so if you want to predict the outcome of who's going to win a match between Bayern, Munich and
Manchester,
Manchester, so you can bet on it and make money. There's a way of using remote viewing to allow you to predict that. And that level of remote viewing, it doesn't require that you do an amazing job that gives you all kinds of details about the event. It's a way of just predicting with a very minimal remote viewing session which way the game is going to go in advance of the actual game. So it is a way of, I talk about in terms of you're sending yourself a message from the future, right? Who's going to win the game? Your future self is telling your present self who's going to win the game tomorrow, and then you can act on that and bet on the game. And I presume that's legal in Germany. I'm not sure, but
yeah, but it's, I mean, whether it's legal or not, it's just mind blowing, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, so where are the limits?
Well, for example, with ARV. If you're just going to guess between Manchester and Munich who's going to win, you have 50% chance. I'm mixing my terms here. A 50% chance that you are going to get it right. So you're going to win as often as you lose over a period of time. ARV, if it's done properly, generally gives you 70 to 80% success rate in making that prediction. Mm-hmm. And that's been demonstrated many times. I can give you some examples of some actual research that was done, double blind and all that stuff. And people are making money with that today. So limitation is you aren't 100% there. There's a chance, a roughly 20 to 30% chance that you're going to get it wrong. And so we actually got involved in a sports betting project back in 2002, I and a business partner of mine, and we were correct close to 90% of the time.
Wow.
And back then you could do sports betting in the United States on the internet. So we were right 90% of the time, and we bet on all of those, and we still lost money.
Mm-hmm.
It's because we didn't know about the point spread. We were amateurs here. We didn't understand point spread, which I still don't understand. but as a consequence, we were right 90% of the time, and we still lost because of the complications that are associated with different kinds of investing. And the same thing can happen in the stock market. If you're right, say 80% of the time, you pick the right stock and take the right action, like sell or buy, you can still end up losing money, because if the one you're wrong about happens to be a massive sell-off, it can wipe out your entire profit. So you have to be very cautious from the investing standpoint on how you use associative remote viewing, even though it really does give you a significant edge in the process. I just saw an internet posting from some folks that did an experiment on the Texas Pick 3 lottery using associative remote viewing, and they won it. They won the Pick 3 lottery using associative remote viewing. I had a student who used what I taught her using ARV. She played the Texas Pick 3 lottery for 2 weeks solid, bet every day, did an associative remote viewing every day. 8 times she got 2 numbers in a row correct in the right order, which already that's huge odds. That's huge odds. But she won it twice in that 2-week period, which if you do the calculation on that, I think I figured out it's like 1 chance in 71,000 that you can pull that off. And she was just using remote viewing to do it. So,
I mean, this is incredible. And what I don't get is why, if these phenomena do exist, although we don't have a theoretical explanation, a proper one, but we can learn it, and it seems to be practical, so you achieve some results with this. My question is, why on earth do so few people know about that? Why don't they just sort of, I mean, why don't you have literally thousands of people knocking at your door and saying, teach me, because that can be beneficial. So what's happening there? I don't get that.
Well, you run into a problem. There's essentially a concerted effort in the skeptical and the mainstream science community not to acknowledge this. In fact, skeptics are actually actively trying to suppress it. I don't want to sound like I'm a conspiracy theorist, because I'm not. This makes sense actually in a history and philosophy of science context. A lot of folks know about Thomas Kuhn, who was the one who brought the word paradigm into our lexicon. Kuhn talked about scientific paradigms and how science changes. And evidence in and of itself won't change the scientific mind. You have to have an actual way of fitting it into theoretical context that actually fits into the bigger scientific context. And so we haven't been able to do that. The suggestions I made about non-locality are just speculations, really, when you get right down to it. They're hypotheses for which it seems unclear how we can come up with any experiment to confirm. So we don't have an explanatory context that fits neatly into the physical world, and therefore mainstream science is never going to accept it, and in fact is going to actively push against it, because it seems to violate their paradigm. It seems to be outside of their paradigm altogether. And you know, people object to comparing this to religions, but if you think about it, if somebody comes up to you and tells you that your religion is wrong, and it's wrong for these reasons, or there's the evidence that's wrong, that doesn't convince you to switch your religion. What it does is it convinces you to dig in your feet and resist this evidence, right? And that's what's happening in mainstream science in regard to ESP, remote viewing, and this kind of thing, is because it doesn't make sense in their context, and therefore they're not going to accept it until it does. And since I don't think it ever will, we're probably going to have this tension for a long time. And it doesn't matter how much evidence you produce. Evidence isn't proof in science. Science actually doesn't ever proof anything. Proof is something that belongs to mathematics and the law. Science doesn't prove anything. They just develop the preponderance of evidence for or against a proposition, or or as we'd say, a theory. So
it was also Kuhn, I think, who coined the term of scientific revolution, right?
yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And so basically the reason why so many people actually are skeptic about it, about this phenomenon of ESP and remote perception and all these kind of things, is because the scientific paradigm is still sort of stuck in an old kind of fashion. And it's not, it hasn't turned into a new sort of updated theoretical model of our reality. The paradigm hasn't really shifted. And because we are sort of, because this paradigm shift hasn't happened, this scientific revolution hasn't happened, this new paradigm has not become mainstream yet. That is the main reason, as you think, that so many skeptics are still around. So a lot of people don't really want to touch it because for them it doesn't seem plausible, right? So it seems not to make sense. It's, as Einstein has put it, as you said, it seems to be spooky, and hence they don't want to sort of get in touch with us. But on the other hand, if we would assume that this knowledge would turn into mainstream knowledge, that it actually will be taught in universities and schools, that would basically sort of open up the door for people to be more open to this kind of phenomenon, and then to probably knock at your door and sort of get to learn it for themselves. So I think the milestone or the current burden is really with the scientific paradigm, as you say.
Yeah, and that paradigm is what's broadly called physicalism. The idea of physicalism is that everything in the universe is physical, or it's a consequence of physical fact. So, for example, there are non-physical things in the physical universe. For the idea of historical, right? Historical isn't a physical thing; it's a meta concept. But in order for you to have something that's historical, you have to have physical things. And without those physical things, the idea of historical doesn't make any sense at all. So that's what I mean when I say consequence of physical facts, right? And in my PhD dissertation, I actually argued against the truth of physicalism, pointing out that there are some major gaps in that assumption. It basically boils down to assumption, in a way, what you might call a self-fulfilling prophecy, to speak loosely, but it's really a tautology. In philosophy, a tautology is a conclusion that assumes the consequent is true, and it's not. It's a logical fallacy when you get right down to it. So physicalism is a logical fallacy, right? It's based on an induction, which is that we've examined this phenomenon and it's proved to be physical. We've examined this phenomenon, it's proved to be physical. We've examined this phenomenon and it's proved to be physical. Therefore, every phenomenon we encounter, even if we haven't examined it yet, must be physical. And people reason this way all the time. You know, the sun came up yesterday, it came up the day before, it came up the day before that, came up today, therefore it's going to come up tomorrow. Now, that's a very reliable induction, but induction is actually not logical, because it depends on the facts of the universe to be true. So it's possible that maybe the sun will explode tonight sometime, at which point it won't come up tomorrow, right? So an induction can be defeated by a counterexample, the idea of white swans. Well, this swan is white, this swan is white, this one is white, therefore all swans are white. And that works very well until you find a black swan, which actually happened. They discovered a variety of swan in Australia that's black, but can interbreed with white swans. I don't know if you get gray swans when you do that, but yeah, that's right. So that destroyed the induction that all swans are white. And so the worry is that ESP, because it isn't physical, it meets none of the criteria for something physical, may well be that black swan. But because all the physicists are white swan believers, they reject the idea that there might be a black swan, right? And that presents problems. So in my dissertation, I argued that, in fact, it's more complicated than this, but I don't want to get into it in great detail. I argued that in fact this is the black swan, that the ESP evidence, and I spent 3 chapters in that dissertation detailing the evidence. Maybe it was 4 chapters actually, detailing the evidence, and it's very powerful evidence. And then I made a philosophical argument why it isn't legitimate for the physicalists to reject that data in trying to save their own theory or their own essentially metaphysical view of the universe, because physicalism is a metaphysical proposition. It isn't a scientific proposition. So.
It's interesting because I already told you when you were here, right? I was actually downloading your dissertation and I was reading it. So I'm a crazy mad German guy, right? Who's diving really deep into this stuff, and I can just confirm there is a lot of sort of logic and a lot of plausibility in how you argue, and I find it extremely interesting. And for those who might not want to dive into your dissertation, I think the books that you have written are also a very good starting point to get into this subject matter. And I will just like pick up the idea of, okay, there is mainstream knowledge, and a lot of skeptics basically are skeptics because of the mainstream paradigm, which hasn't sort of shifted yet. But nevertheless, this doesn't necessarily mean that everyone has to actually stick to this mainstream paradigm, because we are independent individuals, and I think we are all invited to, if we want to make up our own mind on these kind of things, to get informed about those kind of things, and we are not necessarily obliged to believe the mainstream paradigm. I think these paradigm shifts happen because some people probably get a little bit of an independent mind, and look for their own kind of conclusions, digesting pieces of information and putting together the pieces of the jigsaw to come up with their own kind of conclusion how the reality works.
And in fact, it's interesting. There are quite a few mainstream scientists who actually buy into the idea of ESP, even remote viewing. There have been a number of surveys done. Obviously, they don't disclose the names, right? But they've surveyed scientists and got a feel for how many of them are supportive of these concepts. And there's quite a few. But because of the nature of science, at least the sociology of science, they are very reluctant to publicly be known as supporters of this stuff. But there are even some who are in public. We were both at a conference this summer, the Society for Scientific Exploration in Colorado, right? We went to that conference, and that's where we first met.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people attending there who are full-fledged card-carrying scientists and are willing to come and talk about this stuff in a public venue. So there are those who are in the closet, but there are quite a few who are out of the closet as well. I suppose it's like at a university, once you get tenure, you can say anything you want, right?
Yeah. No, this is true. And as you referred to the conference of the Society of Scientific Exploration in Colorado, we actually did a survey there as well, which it's probably not statistically relevant, and probably the audience is a bit sort of biased into one direction. But when we did the survey, we basically, one of the questions we asked them was, what is the role of consciousness, and has consciousness, or does consciousness play a more fundamental role? And I think we were around 80% or 86% of the audience was thinking that consciousness plays a fundamental role. So that is basically what's happened. So let's just really wrap up here. I think we have it's tremendous. You've been experiencing all of those kind of top secret investigations with the US military, then the collaboration with the Stanford Research Institute. It seems that there is solid evidence, or at least indicating that this is a real phenomenon. We don't know the theory that well, but we can practically learn it. And the reason why most of the people don't really get in touch with this is because it's not yet mainstream. But the good news is we can actually really dive into this on our own. We can draw our own conclusions, and we can engage with people like you. And that's why I love the fact that we have met in Colorado. I love the fact that you have visited us over here in Germany, and that we have been able to sit down and spend so much time. And I'm just very grateful for us to have had the opportunity to summarize this in this video, which will hopefully be of use for other people who can then sort of look into this and draw their own conclusions. And then they can decide whether they would want to stick to mainstream knowledge or whether they would want to sort of divert into their own kind of investigations and see. And probably some of those people will knock at your door and turn into remote viewers in the future then. So we never know. It's certainly worth investigation from my point of view.
I have to say I'm awestruck at your ability to capture everything we've talked about it and sum it up so neatly. You're really good. I'm very impressed. And I hope we actually have other opportunities to talk. I mean, there's plenty of terrain that we haven't covered today that we could still get in. So, with the time zones and both of our busy schedules, it's hard to get together. But hopefully, I would look forward to having a further conversation.
Yeah, this is certainly something which we should plan for, and thanks for offering your time to do so. And I admire your work, right? I mean, I admire you as a person, as you know. I admire your work. I think you really tackle it from a non-fluffy kind of point of view. You are really sort of clear in how you argue your case, and so far I haven't found any flaws in what you basically tell me and what.
Well, I wish I could say the same about my wife.
Yeah, this is probably a good moment to stop here and then have another conversation. Hey, Paul, I know that you're busy. I know that you're about to get your flight to Europe for another conference, and I'm just extremely grateful for the opportunity to talk to you today. And as you say, we will certainly pick this up. We will probably do a number of deep dives into specific topics, and also to then weave it together with other scientific findings, right? Because you know that is what I'm doing. I'm looking at different sort of scientific explorations here. I'm weaving together the wisdom of different kind of scientists in order to really sort of see whether this new paradigm is plausible and solid, and then to probably invite people to, as we said before, to start thinking about this on their own.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, this has been a lot of fun, and I'm really glad that we were able to take the time to do it.
Thank you very much, Paul. We will certainly be in touch very soon. Thank you very much.
You bet.